Good evening, everybody. Web is brought to you in conjunction with Sarum College. And this evening, Ruth will be talking to Dr. Michael Hahn and Dr. Eleanor McLaughlin. And the conversation will be about the works of St Francis of Assisi, establishing how useful they are in conversations about the church, theology, and faith today. I'm Amanda Davison-Young, I'm the CEO of The Tablet, and so without further ado, I shall hand you over to Ruth. Many thanks.
Welcome everybody, and it's nice to see so many people here this evening. Our panel, as Amanda said, consists of Dr. Michael Hahn and Dr. Ellie McLaughlin, and they run the MA programs in Christian spirituality and theology, imagination and culture, respectively, at Sarum College in Salisbury, who are kindly sponsoring this event for us. Michael is a medieval theological historian working on early Franciscan mystical traditions. He specializes in medieval spirituality, the Franciscans, and the development of mystical theology. He has a book, Bonaventure, Angela of Foligno, and Late Medieval Mystical Theologies, published by Routledge, and is interested in the mystical element of songwriting, modern mysticisms, and the comparative study of religion. He recently completed a Mellon postdoctoral research fellowship at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto, Canada. Eleanor, or Ellie, is a theologian working on Dietrich Bonhoeffer and disability theology. She's given talks on subjects such as disability, technology, and human flourishing. And alongside her role as Theology, Imagination and Culture Programme leader, she's a research associate at the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. Her publications include Unconscious Christianity in Bonhoeffer's Late Theology, Encounters with the Unknown Christ, and that book has a foreword by Rowan Williams. So I think we're very excited to hear what these really interesting two people have to say to us this evening. You don't want to hear much more from me, I think, so I will hand right over to Dr. Hahn.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Ruth. I will just share my screen. There we are. Can everyone see that? Yes. Oh, great. So just before we start, just a very brief comment about what Ellie and I are going to be doing this evening. So we're going to start by, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about St Francis, giving an introduction to his life, his spirituality, and then I'm going to pick out three themes from his texts and the texts about him. So disability, ecology, and art. And then Ellie is going to pick up on those three themes in reference to modern theology and to think about what the possible connections are between St. Francis and modern theological concerns about those three topics. So St. Francis of Assisi is one of the most famous, one of the most beloved saints in the Christian tradition. Born in either 1181 or 1182, he lived in really a time of major cultural, economic, and theological change, he himself being the instigator for much of that theological change. At the end of the 12th century and the start of the 13th century, we saw a great deal of change in the way that work happened in industrial revolution. And with that, a shift of people tending to live more in the countryside to more living in towns and cities. Alongside this, Francis himself was the son of a wealthy cloth merchant. So Francis wasn't a member of the nobility, but was someone who grew up in relative wealth, relative comfort, and certainly someone who knew the value of money. He, like many before him and many after him, moved from this to convert to a life in dedication to Christ, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. He is perhaps most famous in Christian history as the founder of the Franciscan movement. He himself founding the Order of Lesser Brothers, sometimes called the Order of Friars Minor, and being inspirational for many other orders and many other movements as well, such as the Poor Clares and the Tertiaries. So Francis is living in pretty central Italy, so in Umbria, the city of Assisi. Today, if you were going to go from Rome to Assisi, it's about an hour and a half on the train. And Assisi is a hilltop city today very much dominated by the heritage of St. Francis. So if you went today, you would be surrounded by tourists and worshippers who were there to really look at the heritage left by St. Francis. A lot of the architecture in Assisi today are churches, basilicas about St. Francis, St. Clare, other Franciscan saints. But in Francis's own day, it was, it was very much still a center for Christianity. On the screen is the San Rufino Piazza and the San Rufino Cathedral, both present in St. Francis's day. He preached in and outside of this cathedral. St. Clare of Assisi's house, her family house, was in this piazza. So Francis, as I say, converted from a life of wealth to a life in dedication to Christ. He did this in quite a performative way, in a very public manner. So his father, the cloth merchant, wanting to really attract Francis back to his own lifestyle, took Francis into the town square of Assisi, as you see on the screen. So this is a very public venue. He tries to persuade Francis to come back home with him, to renounce his new lifestyle dedicated to Christ. But Francis really turns this on its head. So we have, and one of the early texts about Francis said that Francis took off all his clothes and, putting the money on top of them, came out naked before the bishop, his father, and all the bystanders, saying, "Until now I have called Pietro di Bernardone," that's his father, "my father, but wanting to say from now on, our Father who art in heaven." Francis here really doing two things. Firstly, renouncing in a symbolic way his earthly life. He takes off his earthly clothes and instead is wrapped in the bishop's robe. But secondly, also in a more legal way, he is disinheriting himself from his father's wealth. He is saying that this earthly wealth is something I don't want to be associated with anymore, and moving beyond that, or certainly away from that, into this life dedicated to Christ. There are many central aspects of Francis's own spirituality, and indeed the spirituality which characterize the Franciscans even today still. So as I said earlier, Francis founded the Order of Lesser Brothers. This was an order not of monks, but of friars instead, and this is quite an important distinction. So monks had previously, and continued after this, to be orders which lived in enclosed houses, typically in the countryside. So they lived really on their own, away from society. The friars, including Francis's own order, instead wanted to live in the cities, in and among the people. They really were a brotherhood. So they were not enclosed, but they would live together, but would go out in and among the people. Francis really wanted his brothers to reject money. He said that coins had no more worth than stones. While previous religious orders of monks and nuns had, on an individual level, rejected money, so monks and nuns had given up all of their wealth when they had entered a monastery, the Franciscans also rejected communal wealth. So the houses of friars themselves did not own any of the things that they used in their day-to-day life. And for Francis, this was really that he didn't want the brothers to be storing up earthly wealth. He wanted the brothers to be living day to day, so they would go out and beg or work, but really just for their day-to-day sustenance, not building up wealth for the future. Francis is most often associated with poverty, but really in his own writings, in his own time, in his own teachings, he emphasized wisdom, simplicity, poverty, humility, charity, and obedience, all on equal footing with each other. Alongside this, Francis had a deep and vivid remembrance of the life of Christ, particularly the suffering of Christ in Christ's passion. And Francis really wanted himself and to encourage his brothers to imitate Christ in lots of different ways. And I think one of the central aspects of Franciscan spirituality, certainly in Francis's own day, is that we should see Christ as having been poor in his physical life, but also that we should acknowledge, according to Francis, that the process of the incarnation, the process by which by which the second person of the Trinity became the God-man, as lots of Franciscans say, is itself a process of impoverishment. And Francis and lots of his early followers really emphasize that. The Franciscan movement, the orders which Francis founded, very quickly gained traction, very quickly gained popularity. They grew in numbers very rapidly and also expanded throughout and beyond Europe. Next year is the 800th anniversary, for example, of the Franciscan friars arriving in England. As well as the friars themselves, Francis was involved in the foundation of several orders of Franciscan nuns, also being inspirational for the Order of Penance, which later on would become the Third Order of St Francis. But Francis, but like with many orders and movements which develop and grow, there quickly starts to be division in those movements. And Francis, towards the end of his life, stood back from the organization within the order and stood back himself from being its leader. Towards the end of his life, he went on retreat to Mount Laverna, sometimes called Mount Alverna. And there he had a vision of a seraph, so a six-winged angel with Christ at the center of the seraph. Upon having that vision, Francis is said to have received the stigmata, so the 5 wounds of Christ. You might be able to see on this image that there are lines basically between Christ's wounds and Francis's wounds. They are being directly transposed onto Francis. And one thing that's quite important is that often in art, Francis's side wound is on the opposite side to Christ's side wound, meaning that Francis and Christ embraced each other face to face. And you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of this image, the figure of St Bonaventure, who we'll mention a little bit later. And Bonaventure was one of the figures who fairly early on wrote down the life of St Francis. Within 50 years of Francis's death, there were at least 13 different Latin lives or legends written about Francis. Inevitably, not all of these lives or legends said exactly the same thing. And there was a move to institutionalizing the life of Francis, to really developing and changing the agenda behind the way Francis was presented. One recent scholar who has picked up on this changing agenda of the life of St. Francis in the first 50 or so years after his death is Donna Trembinski. And she recently, I think in 2020, published her award-winning book, Illness and Authority, Disability in the Life and Lives of Francis of Assisi. And it's this theme of disability and chronic illness, which I'll talk about first today. So Donna Trembinski wants to emphasize that throughout this first 50 or so years after Francis's death, there is a move by which people writing about Francis decreasingly acknowledged the illness and the disability in his life. And Trembinski says that very few biographies, even recent ones, mention Francis's illnesses, except in passing, which no doubt owes to the modern propensity for disappearing and invalidating bodies and individuals who exist outside the given parameters for healthy, whole, normative, or average. So this wasn't just something which happened in the first 50 or 100 years after Francis's death, but according to Trembinski, this is something that's happening even today. Even very well respected, very well researched historical biographies of Francis of Assisi tend to neglect this aspect of Francis's life. Trembinski continues that Francis's early biographers recognized that his illnesses and consequent lack of secular power within the order he had founded were of concern for the legacy of the saint, and to compensate, they employed different narrative strategies to demonstrate the saint's moral authority. So that those within the first sometime 15, 20 years even of Francis's death very quickly realized that actually these aspects of Francis's life that were central and that shaped the way he lived, the way he performed his own spirituality, had to be, in a way, explained away. Trembinski says that Francis's illnesses, if they are discussed at length at all, are regarded as the mechanism by which Francis was able to attain an even more perfect relationship with God. So Francis, being severely ill for much of his lifetime, was, by his early biographers, shaped into ways in which we could look at Francis and, instead of recognizing his illness or his disability, instead say that these are signs of his humility, of his virtue. And Trembinski says that for those who were Francis's companions, for those who knew him, those who spent time with him, those who worshipped with him, Francis was not yet a saint, but a man who was very sick and could no longer carry out all the duties for which his position called. As such, it's important to recognize that for Francis, the way he carried out his spirituality, the way he worshipped, the way he conducted himself within his religious order was very much shaped by his illness. Trembinski says that some of the best sources we have to recognize this illness and this disability are those written by Francis himself. Francis produced around 25 fairly short texts within his own lifetime, mainly using scribes. 2 texts survive in Francis's own handwriting. We see on the screen the 2 opposite sides of the folio, a folio from a manuscript containing Francis's own handwriting. The red handwriting on the left-hand side, not by Francis, but the black handwriting on both sides being by Francis himself. The left-hand side, while not showing that Francis was, while showing that Francis was by no means a professional scribe or calligrapher, shows that actually he's writing in a fairly uniform hand. The right-hand side, although you can't tell so much from this image, shows actually that a much more inconsistent hand, which Trembinski says is evidence of his very much declining eyesight, an issue that lots of sources tell us really took over his life and impacted the way he lived for the last several years of his life. Trembinski also points towards how even translations of Francis's works and works about Francis today often will translate the Latin in ways which reduce our attention to his disability and chronic illness. So, for example, in talking about an event by which a priest was giving Francis certain things to eat, probably the most reliable English translation published in the last 20 years says that, of course, as the man of God later admitted, he would frequently enjoy delicacies and sweets and refrain from disagreeable foods. So painting Francis in this instance as if he was simply someone who had a very sweet tooth. Trembinski says that when we translate the Latin, we should instead be translating it to say that he, this is Francis, frequently used medical supplements and medicinal preparations and abstained from contrary foods. So that Trembinski pointing out here that there is still this propensity, even in translations of Francis's work, to really take away from this sense that he was someone for whom chronic illness very much affected his life and the way he performed his spirituality. Trembinski concludes by saying that after Francis had become a saint, his hagiographers, so the people who are writing these early legends, these early lives about Francis, were left with the task of normalizing his life and integrating it into the models of the thousands of saints who had come before him. Meaning was found in his suffering and his erratic or unusual behavior, and behavior that seemed at odds with what might be expected of a saint was elided or explained away. In short, Francis's messy life was cleaned up for mass consumption. And Trembinski really emphasizing that by focusing on looking at St. Francis with a lens of disability or chronic illness, we're able to highlight how some of the most significant saints, some of the most significant figures in Christian histories are those we can look to possibly for answers or for ways of looking at theology and chronic illness today. One of the most commonly one of the images of St. Francis that perhaps most commonly comes to mind is of him feeding or him preaching to the birds. These perhaps are those which most people think of initially when they think of St. Francis. And while I would want to say that this is perhaps not the only part of Francis's spirituality we should be thinking of or we should focus on, his love of nature, his acknowledgement that we can see God in nature is really a very significant part of his spirituality. And I think there are two main points I want to make very briefly. One being that he saw all of creation as a fraternity, we could perhaps say a sorority, and also that he thought that we could see God or God's footprints in nature. And I just want to point very briefly to a book that was published, I think, in 2021, Seeing Differently, Franciscans and Creation, written by three Franciscan brothers based in the UK. And if Franciscan theology and ecology or nature is something you're interested in, this is really an excellent book. It's very clearly written. You don't need to be a Franciscan scholar to approach it. It's really written for a very wide audience. And Francis, in his life and his works, in the texts he wrote and those written about him, wanted to emphasize that we should see all of creation, every aspect, every creature, human and otherwise, as being part of this fraternity. So he says, and this is in the text he wrote just before he died, that when I was in sin, so before his conversion, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. That through his conversion, through his lived experience of God and God's presence in the world, Francis had been completely transformed, whereby even from those seen as outcasts, those marginalized from society, he was able to see the inherent goodness in them and the way that they can contribute to society. Possibly Francis's most famous text today is the Canticle of the Creatures, sometimes called the Canticle of the Sun, or sometimes Brother Sun, Sister Moon. In this text, Francis most explicitly lays out how all aspects of creation can be seen as part of this fraternity or sorority. So I've just taken some small selections from his text where he says, "Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures," especially he says, "So brother sun," and then later on, "Sister moon, brother wind, sister water, brother fire, sister mother earth, and sister bodily death." So that every aspect of creation is brought into this fraternal living, this fraternal way of spiritual life for Francis. Another event I'll just mention very briefly is a narrative often called the Wolf of Gubbio. And this is when Francis and his brothers go to the town of Gubbio, which had been terrorized by a very large and very aggressive wolf who had started by killing livestock and then by killing humans who came to remove it. Francis, we're told, on approaching the wolf, was immediately able to tame it and referred to the wolf as Brother Wolf. So we see from these three brief passages or brief narratives of Francis that he brings everything into this idea of fraternity. So he founded his order of friars as an order of brothers, as an order which was a fraternity. But this wasn't a fraternity exclusively for Christian friars. But within this, he also included those who were marginalized, those who were cast out of society, those inanimate parts of creation, and also those who we see as dangerous to society. He brought all of these into this fraternity of creation. In relation to this, Francis is a very significant figure in what we might call natural theology. Natural theology is the idea that by observing nature, by observing creation, we're able to say something or tell something about God. So Francis talks about God's footprints or God's vestiges in nature as being a way that we can observe something about God, we can learn something about God, it's a basis for the way that we do theology, the way that we talk about God. Creation itself is, we might say, deiform, it is godlike, it's in the form of a shape of God. And that itself shows us the way back to this relationship with God. Bonaventure, who lived about, he was about 30 years or so after St Francis, created a text where he talked about the 7 stages by which the soul can come into union with God. The first 2 of these stages are that we should observe God's presence in nature, that we should look at nature and contemplate God through that. Angela of Foligno, who lived about 50 years after St Francis and who was a lay penitent, a forerunner for a Franciscan tertiary, was shown in a vision all of creation. And after this vision, Angela declared, this world is pregnant with or pregnant by God. That every element of creation, not just humans, but the entirety of creation, is gestating God, that God is at the center of all of creation, of every element, not just of humans, but every blade of grass, every animal, every aspect of creation. This idea that God is present in all of creation also allows us to observe the joy and wonder in nature, but also the joy and wonder in art and aesthetics. Francis, at the very start of his religious journey, so just after he had converted to this life of Christianity, went into the ruins of a church called San Damiano, just outside of the city walls of Assisi, on the left-hand side, the modern church, which has been, well, he restored, but the modern church, which has continued to be restored. There he saw a 12th century painting of the cross, which we now refer to as the San Damiano cross. Christ in this image has his eyes wide open. He is surrounded by people, and upon seeing this cross, Francis created a prayer which I think he edited throughout his life, but the form we end up with is, Most High, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. That this cross, observing Christ with his eyes wide open and surrounded by people, was at this tumultuous time in Francis's life, this point of conversion, able to help him on this journey and able to help him to establish or to seek out the will of God. Pietro Marinesi, who has done some work on this recently, points particularly towards the fact that Christ has his eyes open in this and says, the prayer of adoration of the Holy Cross allowed Francis and his brothers to praise God and bless God for those eyes of glory which were open to the entire world of the cross. This image of Christ on the crucifix, but with his eyes wide open, is not one of sorrow, not one where we're mourning Christ's death, but instead, certainly for Francis, is one where we celebrate the glory of God. We celebrate not the sacrifice of Christ, but Christ being in communion with all of creation. Just before I pass over to Ellie, as well as Francis himself being inspired by art and aesthetics, Francis's life was very quickly depicted in various types of art form. If you went to the Basilica of St Francis today, you'll see the cycle of paintings by Giotto, of frescoes by Giotto. Very early on, the Basilica of St Francis, built about 30 or 40 years after Francis's death, featured various stained glass windows depicting St Francis. Angela of Foligno, who I mentioned a few moments ago, herself went on pilgrimage to this basilica. On her journey to Assisi, she had felt the presence of the Holy Spirit join her and accompany her on this journey. But as she stepped into the basilica, 2 things happened simultaneously. Firstly, she felt the Holy Spirit leave her, and she fell on the floor, screaming out of the fear that that she would never again gain God's presence. And she looked, just as she was as she was entering the church, she also looked up and to her left and saw this first stained glass window in this cycle. We see on the left-hand side Christ holding St. Francis, and on the right-hand side, the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child. Angela, after falling to the floor, is then hears the voice of God saying, "I will hold you closely to me, and much more closely than can be observed with the eyes of the body." Angela, therefore, sees this stained glass window depicting Francis, this artistic representation of Francis, and not only does that draw her up into this mystical presence of God, but it also partly dictates her very experience of God and what she is told by God. Angela sees Christ and the Virgin Mary holding Francis and the Christ child closely to them, and God promises Angela that he will hold her to him even more closely than she sees in this stained glass window. Beyond that time, St. Francis has continuously been depicted in various different ways in art across the entire world. As I think you're hearing in next week's session, there is also an exhibition at the National Gallery on St. Francis of Assisi from the 6th of May to the 30th of June, which I think demonstrates just the centrality of the artistic and the aesthetic when we're thinking about the life and the spirituality of St. Francis. So thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen and pass over to Ellie.
Thank you, Michael. That was a really interesting presentation. For anyone wondering about the books that Michael mentioned and that Ellie will also mention, we will be sending out a reading list after the event, so don't worry if you didn't catch all the details. And also, just a reminder, if you wish to ask either of our speakers a question, please feel free to post it in the chat section of this Zoom. And Michael just mentioned the exhibition, and of course we have a big feature in this coming tablet this week by Joanna Moorhead on this subject, and that's really a very good read indeed. So there's lots happening about it. So, but without further ado, I'll hand over to Ellie.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the warm welcome, Ruth and Amanda. It's lovely to be here and be speaking with all of you this evening. Can everyone see my screen? Let's just check before we get started. Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to do now, following on from Michael, is to talk about the echoes, if you like, that we can hear in contemporary theological discussions, the echoes of both Francis's life and his work. And so we'll think about those two things in conjunction with current theological debate. And I thought we could start by picking up on some of what Michael was saying about questions around disability theology, disability and chronic illness in Francis's life. So disability theology is a field in contemporary theological discussion. This field is really spearheaded by Nancy Eastland, who sadly passed away in 2009. She was the assistant professor of sociology and religion, sociology of religion and disability studies at Candler School of Theology. She writes from a perspective of someone with a disability. She was born with a congenital bone defect. So she's very much inhabiting the embodied experience of disability whilst also writing about it from a theological perspective. She's concerned in her work that still today, a lot of people with disabilities are misrepresented in the church, and Michael was talking about this concern of disabled people being disappeared, being invalidated, and being misrepresented in our texts. This is a concern that Eastland shares. And she writes in her groundbreaking book, The Disabled God, the persistent thread within the Christian tradition has been that disability denotes an unusual relationship with God, and that the person with disabilities is either divinely blessed or damned, the defiled evildoer or the spiritual superhero. As is often the case with such starkly contrasting characterizations, neither adequately represents the ordinary lives and lived realities of most people with disabilities. So she's helping us here remember the real experience of people with disabilities rather than a kind of extreme perspective in either direction. And thinking about this point that people with disabilities are often disappeared or invalidated in modern times, Eastland argues that one way that this is happening is through the linking of disability to sin. And she argues that people with disabilities have often been ostracized through this identification of disability with sin. Or it can sometimes be referred to as a travesty of the divine image, or an inherent desecration of all things holy. And she points to biblical texts such as John 5:14 or Hebrews 9:13-14 as examples of how these texts could be read in a way that gives rise to this idea that there is a link between sin and disability, which of course Eastland is going to read these texts and propose a different interpretation. But what she's saying is that for a very long time in Christian tradition, these texts and others have been read in ways that promote the idea that there is a link between sin and disability. When people with disabilities are seen, rather than being kind of disappeared or invalidated, often they have been presented, argues Eastland, as having the opportunity to be ideals of virtuous suffering. And here she points to 2 Corinthians 12, the passage in which Paul is talking about a thorn in his flesh. This is problematic, of course, because it separates disabled people out from quote unquote normal people, erecting barriers between us and them, which should not be there in the first place. And again, in this kind of, she opens her argument with this presentation of the persistent problems that she sees within the Christian tradition that have erected these barriers, if you like, between us and them, separating out disabled from non-disabled people. The fourth point that she makes to set up her stall, if you like, is that the church has divorced the search for justice from charitable giving. And here she refers to passages like Amos 5, where we see a call to give to the needy in conjunction with a call to seek justice for the oppressed. And Eastland will argue that when these two are separated, we have a situation in which people can give money to help others that they see as being marginalized or disadvantaged, but without trying to stop or redress the injustices that are at the root of this marginalization. And so divorcing charitable giving from justice continues this separation between the us and the them. Another person who's thinking through questions around disability theology and who's in whose work I think we can hear echoes of St Francis is Chrissy Thwaites in her chapter Waking Up to Ableism in Christian Communities. So she writes here, consider too how Christian theology has bought into a capitalist work ethic that measures value as economic productivity, or the long history of physically inaccessible church buildings. All of these contribute to an ableist culture in which there is no place for disabled people. Now, particularly in the first part of what Thwaites is saying here, we can look to St Francis as an example of someone who tried to thwart this idea that economic productivity is the only way of life in which you can find value. When he decides to give up his clothing in that stark scene that Michael was talking about earlier, when he decides to say that he no longer calls his biological father, but he wants to talk about our Father who art in heaven. The stepping away from wealth, and here termed as economic productivity, I think is actually in disability theology a really helpful reminder that not everyone is called into this life of productivity that sometimes the church really does buy into. And this sign, I just find the sign so symbolic of this desire that we sometimes see in the church, this desire to kind of get people, back into the economic productivity chain. If you're different from us, the sign seems to say, we would like you to soon be healed and become part of the able-bodied kind of elite. So Thwaites is arguing very strongly here against that kind of thinking. And I think we could easily hear from the life of St Francis that we have exemplars from the Middle Ages that really help us in dismantling this kind of thinking. So I've zipped through some questions around disability theology, but please do feel free to ask more questions in the chat and we can come to those. But I wanted to move on to talk about the point that Michael raised about St. Francis considering all creation as fraternity, human creation and other than human creation alike. And of course, one of the texts that may have popped into your mind when he was talking about that was the recent papal encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home, written by Pope Francis, and which appeared in 2015. This on care for our common home draws heavily, of course, on Franciscan theology. And indeed, as you will probably have noticed, the name Laudato Si, praised be, is the first line of a canticle by St. Francis in praise of God and of all creation. In section 10 of this encyclical, Pope Francis writes, "I do not want to write this encyclical without turning to that attractive and compelling figure whose name I took as my guide and inspiration when I was elected Bishop of Rome. I believe that St. Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology, lived out joyfully and authentically. He is the patron saint of all who study and work in the area of ecology, and he is also much loved by non-Christians." So how, you might ask, is this being taken up by current scholarship? How are people responding to these kinds of statements made by the current Pope? So one really helpful example is the scholar Celia Dean Drummond, who's based at Campion Hall in Oxford, who's recently, this is volume 1 of a big body of work that she's producing, but volume 1 is called Theological Ethics Through a Multi-Species Lens, The Evolution of Wisdom, volume 1. She is the director of a research centre which was specifically established to carry out research on topics related to Laudato Si, and was established, you can see there, the top image is where it's based at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Dean Drummond works in ethics, and this particular book looks at the relationship between animals and humans, and builds on this tradition established by Francis of co-fraternity, again, rather than this privileging or prioritization of human creation above the rest of creation. And you can see that the way that she frames one of her driving questions for this particular book, she writes, "The second driving question concerns our relationships with animals. There is dissatisfaction with animal rights frameworks and an argument instead for a more complex, community-based, multi-species approach. Hence, rather than extending rights, a more radical approach is a holistic multi-species framework for moral action." And just thinking back to that picture that Michael showed us of St. Francis and the wolf, of course, that might, that's just one image, but it helps you think about what Dean Drummond is trying to get at here when she's talking about a complex, community-based, multi-species approach to thinking through moral questions. So that's a very exciting, currently in development, example of how Francis's life and his work are being taken up and extensively debated in contemporary theology. And now finally coming to this question of art and aesthetics. So in contemporary theological aesthetics, we were just looking previously at these stained glass windows, and Michael was talking about Angela of Foligno and her response to seeing the image of St. Francis and how she was inspired by and gained knowledge from artworks. In contemporary theology, this type of experience is often discussed in a field known as theological aesthetics. And Patrick Sherry, who works in this field, has a central idea that God creates beauty through the Holy Spirit, and this beauty foreshadows the world to come. And he writes, the Spirit of God communicates God's beauty to the world, both through creation, in the case of natural beauty, and through inspiration, in the case of artistic beauty. That earthly beauty is thus a reflection of divine glory and a sign of the way in which the Spirit is perfecting creation. And that beauty has an eschatological significance in that it is an anticipation of the restored and transfigured world, which will, there should be a B there, which will be the fullness of God's kingdom. So here we tap into both the idea of being inspired by artistic beauty and the idea of natural theology found in Francis's work. And I lost my notes. I'm getting back to my notes. And St. Francis also, his example reminds us that in theological discourse, it's not only the rational that is treated as, important theological ideas. Of course, that is an integral part of theological discussion. But I think he's a helpful reminder that we have these feelings of awe and wonder that are given a lot of space in the field of theological aesthetics that can be really powerful contributors to theological discourse. So, for example, if we were to follow in Patrick Sherry's footsteps here, we would think that we're not simply looking at the natural world to argue for the existence of God. You could look at philosophical theology and arguments from nature for the existence of God, for example, intelligent design. That's not what theological aesthetics is really interested in doing. Instead, there is this claim that the Holy Spirit communicates God's beauty, and it relies on our experiences and our feelings rather than on our rationality. So in the field of theological aesthetics, these experiences of awe, wonder, and peace are given more space than in some other areas of theology. We were mentioning resources earlier. I'm very happy to share these slides if that would be helpful, that outline some of the resources used here. And as we've been drawing out in this session, St. Francis's life and work are still very relevant to many debates in contemporary theology. We've chosen to highlight 3, but there are of course many more. And 3 of the scholars that we've mentioned today, Donna Trembinski, Brother Samuel Double, and Just Giustra, will be all contributing to our upcoming summer school at Sarum College that Michael and I will also be contributing to. So if you're interested about finding out more about that, please do contact us. And we're very happy to answer questions, but there will be people who know a lot about St. Francis and his contribution to contemporary theology who will be teaching on that week. So if this has whetted your appetite, do come and find out more. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you so much, Ellie. That was really, really terrific. And I learnt so much there. There was so much I didn't know and don't know. And that was kind of, there's so much to understand and to learn about St. Francis. And so he was not a theologian. And yet, just in this short period we've had together tonight, I've seen, how much there is there that can be a foundation for a theology of St. Francis. So we have got quite a few questions, actually. So I'm really sorry, we probably won't get through them all. But I've got one here that I'll put to Michael first, and then Ellie, there's one for you after that. So Michael, first, if you could answer this question from Larry Wright. You referenced the incarnation. Is this an event or a process? And if so, what is the nature of this process?
So I think lots of different figures in the history of Christianity would have different answers to that. I think in terms of the way that Francis himself talks about it, and the way that some of the early figures like Bonaventure and Angelo Foligno would talk about it, to some extent it's both. And I think that the incarnation is very much a process which is continuing for people like Francis and Bonaventure. So the incarnation is very much related to creation. So Bonaventure, for example, would say that creation happens, so that you have the inner workings of the Trinity, and from that you have this almost Meister Eckhart, who's another medieval theologian, says this almost bubbling over of the Trinity, and Bonaventure somewhat agrees with that. So that you have the Trinity, the inner life of the Trinity. From this, creation happens, and incarnation is a process that happens almost in response to and imitation of this. But for a lot of Franciscans, it's very important to recognize that this is also, to some extent, a specific event that happens, and that the way that Christ is incarnated, the way that Christ comes through what's often called a kenosis or kenotic process, is itself very important. The quote from Angelo of Foligno, that the world is pregnant with God, I think emphasizes that it is an event, but it's also a process that is continuing to happen. Ellie mentioned, I think it was in relation to aesthetics, this idea of eschatology, this idea of the end things. And a lot of early Franciscan writers, and I'm sure a lot of more recent Franciscan writers as well, would say that we're reminded by eschatology that creation and incarnation are not things that happened once. They're things that are continuing to happen, that creation is not yet complete. In the Bible, there are lots and lots of quotations and imagery created that emphasize that. So we see the idea that you see God through a glass darkly or through a mirror in an obscure way, but then we will see face to face. One of the other metaphors that's often used is of the earth groaning in labor pains. And this is, I think, quite similar to what Angelo of Foligno is saying by this world is pregnant with God. That creation and incarnation are these processes that are continually happening and happening in every element, every aspect of creation, that we are not yet what we should be. And I think that relates partly to also what Pope Francis is saying in Laudato Si. He says that every creature or every aspect of creation is a possibility of us coming to know God, and we have no right to disrupt that. The human responsibility for climate change is removing the opportunities of species and of various aspects of creation to live out God's will and to reveal to us God, to reveal God to us. So I think that it to some extent, sorry to sit on the fence, but I think is both a specific event, but also this process which is continually happening today and will continue to happen.
Thank you, Michael. And we have another question on the incarnation, but first, before we move to that, I'll ask Ellie. Ellie, I wonder if you could address this question from Hilary, please. Can Francis of Assisi be viewed as the original Earth Day advocate?
Oh my goodness. I suppose, I would need to know more about the background to the current Earth Day movement and why that was founded, which I don't know the kind of theoretical background to the people who instigated Earth Day. But I think it would be safe to say that for people who are trying to live in harmony with all of creation, whether human or other than human, there is certainly a source in St Francis that absolutely can't be ignored. So again, it would depend on how you live out your Earth Day and what particular significance you attach to it. But I would definitely say that there's there's a link between the motivations of people today who are keeping Earth Day and how Francis thought life should be lived in that communal, not trying to take as much as you can for yourself, but very much a kind of living in his terms brotherhood. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Yes, I think Earth Day is around about this time. I'm not exactly sure, can't quite remember when exactly it is, but so we're kind of in it a little bit at the moment, but it is quite interesting. It's a secular event. But you're right, I think St Francis is kind of would be a suitable Earth Day saint if it wasn't, if it was not to be a secular event. So if you could, I'll ask this one of you first, Ellie, and then Michael, also if you could address it, because we have this quite interesting question from Hayden that follows on from the previous discussion about the incarnation. So Hayden says, as I understand it, St Francis was awestruck by the incarnation of Christ and also the incarnation through the blessed sacrament of Mass. Is this correct?
Oh, I'm going to pass that straight to Michael because he will know exactly what to say about that.
Thanks, Ellie.
Yeah, so I think for Francis, as with lots of other medieval theologians, Mass was a very significant point. We might think of Francis as a mystic or as somehow related to mysticism. And for lots of medieval mystics, including Francis, the Mass was a very specific way in which we can relate to this sort of inner working, the inner life of the incarnate Christ, and we can have a particular experience of Christ's presence. So Mass was very important, I think, for Francis and lots of his early followers, both Bonaventure and Angela of Foligno, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, I think Ellen, who I'm starting to suspect might be Ellen Teague, has suggested that Earth Day is this Saturday, the 22nd of April, and it will be marked by climate protesters in central London. And quite right too, I knew it was coming up. So we've got another question in this area. Ellie, if you could address this first. What is your assessment of the concept of the cosmic Christ of Dr. Matthew Fox?
Oh, would whoever asked the question like to just brief me on Dr. Matthew Fox's concept?
That is Ellen who asked this question. Let's see if I can find her. Ellen, do you want to come in and quickly say, we haven't got much time, Ellen, so if you could just keep it very, very brief, if you're there.
Well, Francis talked about, the natural world being, respect for the natural world was part of respecting other people, respecting other species and so on, which Celia Dean Drummond picks up. All of this was highlighted by Dr. Matthew Fox as a creation theologian who's been very much spurned by the Catholic Church. In fact, he's left the Catholic Church now, was Dominican priest. But many of us feel this idea of the cosmic Christ, Christ of all creation, is very important for our times. I mean, I'll be with the protesters on Saturday because I believe this. And he's been an inspiration with his book, Original Blessing.
And you'll be covering it for us, won't you, Ellen?
Of course.
Thank you for your hard work. So, Ellie, briefly.
Yes, so I think that I think that there is a lot of momentum, people talking about God being entangled with creation is another phrase that is coming up more and more in environmental theology. And certainly, yeah, I would just want to agree that this idea that Christ for all creation rather than Christ for the human bit of creation is something that we need to pay careful attention to. I guess my only note of caution would be that sometimes in this kind of theological discourse, what happens is that you get this move into panentheism, that because Christ is for all creation, then, oh, God is in everything. And whilst there are some contexts in which that statement does actually, I think, hold good, it can then just be picked out of a context in which it makes sense and plastered into a different context. And actually, when you say it without all your supporting statements around it, it's not a good theological statement anymore. So I think that would be my only hesitation. But other than that, I would certainly want to embrace the idea of the Christ for all creation, for sure.
And I think Matthew Fox, if I'm right, has written books quite recently, both on Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich, and kind of retrieving them. And I think that's a move that quite a lot of people are doing in Franciscan theology, of retrieving particular Franciscan saints, particularly at sort of the time of COVID, and how we can look to those figures for particular lessons.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Ellie. There's so much more we could say about all this, and I think more will come out at next week's webinar. And again, thank you to Sarum College for the sponsorship of this webinar tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. And I will hand back to Amanda.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's absolutely illuminating, and it makes me even more want to watch the one next week that's coming up on Francis of Assisi, the tablet webinar. So just to close for this one, and I can remind you that there is the Francis of Assisi from Sarum College. If you use the discount code, you can actually get to their short courses, which start from May, starting with the Bonhoeffer Prison Poetry Day on May 2nd. And the voucher goes right through from May to December. They've got a 4-day summer school in July on Bonaventure's The Life of St Francis. And all of the details for everything, grab your pens, can be found at www.sarum.ac.uk. Short courses, text Christian tradition 2023. I'll make sure all them details are put on the feedback forms for you, along with the book lists of all the books that have been quoted in this webinar. So thank you once again for Sarum College in Salisbury for sponsoring this particular webinar. Coming up from this week, tomorrow, we've got Augustan Spirituality, hosted by Sister Margaret Atkins, OSA. Looking forward to that. She's Nurse of St Augustine in the community at Borbank Hall in Cumbria. This is the third in our series of tablet reflections. If you've missed any of them and you'd like to get the full package, all of them have been recorded. Just go to the tablet website and book your tickets, and we can send them all out. We do have lots of pilgrimages on currently, so the Holy Lands of Patmos, but I think the one you'd be most interested in is the Rome and Assisi with the tablet. So you can join readers of the tablet on a trip to Rome and Assisi in the company of Father Alban McCoy. There are still places available from that, and the trip runs from the 11th to the 19th of September, and that's in conjunction with McCabe Pilgrimages. We've also got pilgrimages out to Turkey, and that's led by Dr. Natalie Watson, who's our theologian and editor and good friend of the Pastoral Review. She's an absolute expert on Turkey, so if you're interested in doing a pilgrimage out to Turkey, then please have a look at that one. That also departs in September. And then we've got the Holy Land and Jordan going out in November, and we have Advent in Rome. Subscribe to the Pastoral Review and the tablet. If you're not a subscriber, then you can find all the details about how to subscribe to either the Pastoral Review or the tablet at www.thetablet.co.uk. And please remember, the tablet is a registered charity. So if you'd like to donate to this year's tablet fundraising campaign, then you can do so by going to our website. Many thanks for supporting the tablet webinars, and a blessed Eastertide to all of you. I hope you have a really good evening, and thanks again to our speakers and for Ruth for hosting this particular webinar for us. On behalf of the tablet team who work behind the scenes on these webinars, I'd just like to say a very good evening to you all.